Hello and welcome to episode 98 of a Plain Accounts webcast series, where every week we get together and tackle at least the gospel lection for this upcoming Sunday. This coming Sunday, I forget what is this Sunday that's coming along. I feel like it's something important. We just went through Lent, Ash Wednesday. It's Easter. It's Easter. Right. Yeah. That's what it is. So we're moving quickly towards Easter, and for any pastor out there who's been ministering through Lent, will probably be glad to see the other side of Easter. It is kind of like a freight train, and we will. Christ rises from the dead, and maybe many pastors go into the tomb after Easter just for a little rest. But we are so thankful to be together, as always, with Danny Quanstrom. Danny, it's good to have your face on the podcast. They get sick of mine after a while.
Great to be here.
Yeah. And we're honored to have Jacob Morris as not only our gospel commentator for this week, but as our guest on the podcast. Jacob, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be with you guys.
Would you tell us a little bit about what you're doing and where God has you currently?
Yeah, so the last couple of years we've been in Europe working with refugees here in the midst of the great migration that's been going on. We spent a little while in Serbia working there, and then we spent a year in Greece, and we've been in Berlin now for about 4 months, kind of working on developing a project and working with an Arabic-speaking church that's here, that's meeting in one of our Nazarene churches, trying to help out there as best we can too. So yeah, it's that's where we're at right now, trying to figure out the way forward.
Wow, that's wonderful.
You have another little one on the way.
Yeah, we have two. We have Elias, he's 6, and Miriam is 4, and then we have another one due in 10 days.
Wow.
So yeah.
Well, we'll be praying for you for that, and really appreciate, even amidst the busy schedule and time difference, for you to join us today.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. Let me read John 20, 1 through 18, and we'll get our conversation started. I'm going to read this passage from the Common English Bible. It's my preferred translation. John 20, starting with verse 1. Early in the morning of the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. She ran to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." Peter and the other disciple left to go to the tomb. They were running together, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter and was the first to arrive at the tomb. Bending down to look inside, he saw the linen clothes lying there, but he did not go in. Following him, Simon Peter entered the tomb and saw the linen clothes lying there. He also saw the face cloth that had been on Jesus' head. It wasn't on with the other clothes, but was folded up in its own place. Then the other disciple, the one who arrived at the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They didn't yet understand the scripture that Jesus must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to the place where they were staying. Mary stood outside near the tomb crying. As she cried, she bent down to look into the tomb. She saw 2 angels dressed in white, seated where the body of Jesus had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. The angels asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" She replied, "They have taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've put him." As soon as she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she replied, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Don't hold on to me, for I haven't yet gone up to my Father. Go to my brothers and sisters and tell them, I'm going up to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene left and announced to the disciples, "I've seen the Lord." Then she told told them what he had said to her. This is the written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
All right. Well, the best place to start is always at the beginning. We dive in to see that this is the first day of the week. It's still dark. And we see the followers of Christ moving towards, at least Mary Magdalene, moving towards the tomb and saw that the stone had been rolled away. What's the best place for someone who's going to study this passage for Sunday to maybe understand this in context with what John has written?
Well, for John's gospel, details, just specific details in the ways that he tells the story are super important. And they should not be kind of glazed over. And so the fact that he's very specific about the day of the week, and even the time of the day that she comes, it's significant. John's gospel, the way it begins, it's undeniably drawing on creation imagery and creation language and the theology of creation that God's people, that the Jews, that Israel knows so well. And so I think situating this story, understanding that this story is situated in a theology, in the narrative of creation and God's creative activity is super important for understanding what John wants to do here.
Right.
In this passage.
Because we have this reversal of Eve in the garden being the one who's fallen into deception. And then we see Jesus as the gardener, confusing him for the gardener, standing there and leading to the light. Starts off in darkness, leads to the light. She is then made clear by Jesus standing there in the garden, and the new creation is dawned. It's begun. Rather than Eve going off into sin, Mary Magdalene goes off into righteousness, leading others in that way. That's beautiful. I hadn't thought of the creation narrative as a starting point for this passage. That's great.
Which, Jacob, can you talk to us a little bit about the significance of the first day of the week and its relation? You wrote about it in your commentary, but I think it bears repeating here. The significance of the first day of the week and the eighth day of creation and the yearning for the eighth day, and this was not the Sabbath as the Israelites understood, and kind of re-emphasizing for us what the Lord's day is in relationship to resurrection, not Sabbath.
Yeah. So the Sabbath is, God's people, Jews, were willing to die over the Sabbath. That's how important the Sabbath was to them and to who they were as a people, especially in the midst of places and other peoples who were hostile toward them. That was such a crucial part of their identity. And, it comes from, the Sabbath it's for Jews, it was woven into the creation itself. And so the Sabbath represented the culmination of the finishing, the culmination of God's creation, and it's the day on which God rested. And it's the day on which creation itself, and it represents to that completion for the Jews.
Hey, Jacob, you just cut out a little bit. Could you maybe say that again?
Yeah. So the 7-day period, the cyclical period, represents perfection, this perfect creation of God. But in the midst of that perfect creation, that completed creation, there's still evil. There's still terrible things that happen. Death still exists as a part of that creation. And so it didn't take long, especially in the midst of the desperation of exile and the depression of exile. It didn't take long for God's people to begin to hope for a day or a time, apocalyptically, when all that was wrong with the creation would be made new, would be fixed by God. And so they began to refer to that day as the eighth day, outside of the completed creation, something new, a new creation that God was going to do. And they referred to it by the day of the Lord, or by the eighth day. And so, in our passage, it's the first day of the week, so it's not Sabbath. but it's what the church came to refer to as the Lord's Day.
Mm-hmm.
This day outside of the old created order, where the new aeon has begun, where God. I remember Scott Daniels one time referring to the mystery of the resurrection. What Paul means when he talks about the mystery of the resurrection is that, Jesus has reached out into the future and made it available in the present.
Right.
I think that's what's going on with the language. Yeah.
And it's I think the emphasis there on the first day is so good. The first day being being an eighth day. So the first day is now an eighth day. That's outside of kind of the realm of creation that has been up until now.
No, I mean, and this is Alexander Shmemon in his book, Intro to Liturgical Theology, Introduction to Liturgy. He talks about, there's 4 or 5 pages where he talks about the Lord's Day and its understanding, over against or in relationship to the Sabbath as this idea of it's not separated from the old order. Mm-hmm. It's an eighth day. It's still, and the fact that it falls on a Sunday, it's the first day, still a part of it, still in touch with and very much entwined with the old creation, but it's there to make the old creation new too. Mm-hmm. It bleeds out from the Lord's Day into the rest of the old aeon.
Which is why so much we have shaped our worship practices around that eighth day. During Paul's time, they were still debating on whether or not converts should convert first to Judaism, then to Christianity. Like the order was in that way for them, because you're not going to understand Christianity unless you understand Torah, and you're not going to get a good education in Torah unless you're Jewish, right? Yeah, and so that's why there's so much discussion on holy days and customs and food with Paul, because they're having that debate. And yet this idea of gathering on the Sabbath was never a question for them. They would gather on the Sabbath, and then they would move into the Lord's Day and gather for worship over communion, so there wasn't really any separation for them. We come at it 21st century where we've always called Sunday the day of rest, or and liturgically it doesn't really work that way. God's done his greatest work in the resurrection, which is why we gather for our service in recognition of that work of resurrection, to have liturgy, the work ourselves.
And that liturgy and the celebration of that liturgy on the first day, it is the constitutive act for the church. Mm-hmm. The church is not a group of people who just kind of have this thing in common, these beliefs or these things that they agree with. The church is constituted by that practice, that
of worshiping
on the first day, particularly the Eucharist.
Right.
That is the constitutive act of the church.
Mm-hmm. Which
preach.
Oh, yeah. So can we talk for a moment about Peter and the unnamed disciple? Mm. What do we make of these dudes? Or maybe the unnamed disciple is not a dude. We don't know. What do we make of these folks? Peter and the other disciple went towards the tomb. They saw the linen. Simon went in. The head wrap had been moved to another place. Then when the other disciple goes in, he sees and believes. But what's interesting, what does he believe? Because as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then they go home. So what do we make of Simon Peter and this other fellow? And what is he believing? Or she? What is he or she believing? If not the resurrection, they believe that the tomb is empty. Or do they believe Mary? This is what's really interesting.
Well, there's no answer to what he believes. It's not specified. And most of the commentaries that I came across ended up saying that he probably was believing what Mary had told them.
Right.
Her logic is sound. I mean, it's the only thing that makes sense. That someone robbed the grave. There's actually an inscription from Caesar called the Nazareth inscription, that was this. It was basically a warning of death for anyone found robbing the grave, robbing graves in the Roman Empire. And so it was a common occurrence. Regarding the beloved disciple in Peter, when I was a freshman at Trevecca, Andy Johnson, the New Testament professor at NTS, came as the representative, and he preached a sermon on this passage. And he talked about how when we think about Peter, we tend to think about Peter as this very rash character, this person who acts and then thinks, who has no filter. And so he usually ends up speaking up or doing something and then regretting it later. And so a tomb is unclean. Tombs are unclean spaces. And so the way Andy Johnson talked about it was,
which is why the beloved disciple doesn't go into it.
Presumably, yes.
Right.
I mean, that would make the most sense. Even touching it would make him unclean. Standing above the grave of a dead person that was buried made you unclean. And so presumably the disciple whom Jesus loved stops and doesn't go in and looks in, rather, because it would make him unclean. Mm-hmm. Peter, being brash, being, our characterization of him being someone who acts first and thinks later, Peter barges right in without, and says, I'll face the consequences later. And what they look and they see these grave clothes neatly folded and rolled up in places. These aren't grave robbers, unless they're the courteous crook, is something I mentioned in the in the commentary. But no, when they leave and Mary looks in again, she sees these two angels in the tomb. And for John's gospel is the only one that mentions two angels actually in the tomb in this particular position. And remember, those specific details are important for John. Mm-hmm. And he mentions one at the head and one at the foot of where Jesus had lain. And so you have this live nativity, this living image of the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant, this place where it was believed that God's presence would sit, with God's people. You have this image in an unclean place. The hairs on the back of the communities reading this story, seeing this image in their heads would have stood up. The hairs on the back of their necks would have stood on end, because this idea that now, everything that we've thought about God and about, what God was about and what God loved and what God deemed clean and unclean, all of these things are turned on their head now. If the seat of God's presence can be found in an unclean place, it changes everything.
Yeah. You see that the very presence of God has gone to the grave.
Yeah.
The very presence of God has gone to Sheol, to the pit. I
mean, this is what we say in the creed, that he descended into hell. This is what the tradition has often said he's doing on the Sabbath. Is that, I think going to hell included Good Friday as well. I think the cry from the cross, my God, Eloi, Eloi, why have you forsaken me? I think this is
a descent to the dead.
Descending into hell as anything that happens on Holy Saturday. But no, there is no place that God is not. And it really raises some questions if what we understand as hell to be separation from God, it really raises questions about that.
Right, which this is semantics, but that's why I prefer to say that Christ descended to the dead or descended to Hades, because of our particular notions of hell in Western culture. At least we think of hell as kind of a place of a horned being with a spiky tail. I think of Earthworm Jim, if anybody else has goes back to childhood video games. But we have these images of what hell is like, this place of fire and punishment, which, don't hear me saying there is no hell, but what I think we see in the crucifixion of Christ is his descent unto the dead, to Hades, to Sheol, and I think that's what's so particularly striking to me about the reenactment of the Ark of the Covenant and the place of God dwelling on the place of death.
Right.
Yeah, that there is no place that God is not. And I think of the psalmist, where can I flee from your presence?
Yeah.
Where can I run from your spirit? I make my bed in the pit and you are there.
Right.
I cannot run from you even in Sheol. And so if I can go on a slight a tangent here, if we're going to sing how deep the Father's love for us, let's be intentional about what we mean when we say the Father turned his face away. I heard N.T. Wright give a good explanation or good justification for why that lyric should be included, but let's not interpret that to mean that the presence of God was away from the Christ, but that if the Father turned his face away, it was because it was out of brokenness, not out of abandonment.
Mm-hmm.
And so how we interpret the Christ's descent to the dead, whatever we might call it, is important.
Right. And I think avoiding that language of hell, because it's been so co-opted by our different things in Greek literature as well as our culture.
Dante.
Dante more than the Bible.
Yeah.
We kind of see Christ dying and then going and getting the key to death and hell, right? As if he had to die first and then go, which to me says his death didn't really accomplish anything. It was the open door so that he could then go. For me, it's his death that steals the keys.
Yeah.
The death of God steals the keys to Sheol. It's not him moving or going anywhere after he died. Him being buried in the tomb, his act of death is the one that steals the power of death and Sheol.
And to situate it back in the midst of this idea of creation or God's creative activity, Jesus' death is the consequence of his life and the new creation that he embodies and that he proclaims in word and in body, like that he literally embodies and proclaims with his life. The cross is our no to that.
Right.
It's the world's no to that. And the resurrection then is God's yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's this affirmation. But the flip side of this is that, the crucifixion is also God's yes to the lowly, to those who would find themselves on the underside of the empire.
Mm-hmm.
It's at the same time that it's our no, it's also God's yes to those people in the presence of Jesus. My wife and I, we sing a lullaby, a hymn to the kids, and it's we took this song, "God Will Take Care of You," and we actually ended up changing the lyrics from "God will take care of you" to "God will be there with you," is what we ended up singing. Because that's the promise that we can right. assure them of, that God makes. Right. Even unto death, God is there with them.
Which is why we sing, "The Father in his grace remains." We've changed that lyric from "He turns
Father turned his face away."
Yeah.
Well, if we can turn now our conversation a little bit, I want to look at we talked about the angels in white sitting on the place of Christ's where he had been laid. Then and they say these angels say to Mary, "Why are you weeping?" And she said, "They've taken my Lord and I don't know where they've laid him." And then she turned around and saw Jesus, but she didn't recognize Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus asked her the same question, right?
Yep.
Why are you weeping? So she didn't, there's no specific exclamation that Christ is resurrected from the angels or even from Christ himself. And so, but I love that she supposes him to be the gardener. Can we talk about that a little bit? That's important, right? John includes that on purpose. So Jacob, help us out with Mary's assumption that Christ is the gardener, and maybe she's not wrong.
No, I mean, I don't. Once again, I think at least part of it is that we're undeniably in the Garden of Eden.
Right.
You know, we are this story is situated from the moment Jesus is arrested, and then when he's brought back into a garden for the crucifixion. From then on, we are in the Garden of Eden. And
right.
This creation, this new creation, is playing out there, and you know, it's no coincidence that that she understands him or mistakes him for a gardener. Maybe it's not a mistake, like you kind of point out. You know, the passage that most immediately comes to mind for me when I was kind of thinking about this was the turning, the transforming of weapons into plowshares, especially in the midst of America and so much going on right now. So many of the conversations that are going on is, I think that's the kind of, gardening it might be a good glimpse into what some of the work of the new creation might very well be. And particularly the kind of gardening or the kind of creative work that so many of these organizations that are doing. There are organizations now that will take weapons and turn them into farming implements, hand tools for working in gardens. And this is the passage that came to mind for me. This was not a portion of the passage that I really kind of focused on. When it got to where she recognizes Jesus after he says his name, and after he says her name, this was, it got a little too, if I can be honest, some of the commentaries got a little too sentimental for my taste. It's just personally, I think there's some of that certainly is real and there, but for writing this, it was just a little 1,500 words, what really, enough to try and tackle some of that. But no, the fact that she recognizes him as a gardener is significant in the fact that what's going on is new creation, and that God, right. God was the tender of the Garden of Eden.
Wait, there was tinder in the Garden of Eden?
Well,
did
there
God
are only two
right?
people, so
God swiped right.
And it's important to understand, though, that the creation. Okay, okay.
That's Ben.
It's important to understand that the creation narratives they're liturgy. They're not scientific. They're not scientific essays. They're not scientific documents. They're liturgy. They would have been creating this world on the Sabbath for the Jews, but also on in the church's appropriation and use of them as a continuation of Judaism, which is the way the church began as a branch. The use of those liturgies would have created the new creation on the Lord's Day. And so these are liturgies when we read those. And so the gardening image, it's not necessarily meant to be taken literally as someone tending a garden, but it's this idea that this new creation is being tended to by God, and that just like Adam and Eve in the liturgy, just like humans are called to in the liturgy to care for and to steward creation, the new creation involves care and stewardship as well.
Wow.
Which I think bears a lot of importance ecclesiologically. I think many of us will have an experience over the next few weeks where Easter Sunday, we're going to have a packed house, right? It's going to be full. There's going to be a lot of energy. Then the Sunday after Easter, it's like the most deflated Sunday of the year.
Yeah.
Because, in terms of like attendance. And what I think we need to recognize is that our liturgy, our worship every Sunday is the new creation act of God in this world. The gathering for worship is what is recreating a new thing in this world. And that's why there's a conversation on this in a Facebook group that I thought was really neat, was that in Advent, you have the first, second, third Sundays of Advent. But then in Lent, you don't have first, second, third Sundays of Lent. You have the first, second, third Sundays in Lent. Because even in the midst of the wilderness, Sunday is still a celebration of the resurrection. So it's not of Lent. It's a feast day. you fast during the week, fast from, but then on Sundays you feast on. And so Sunday, as the day of worship, as the day of liturgy, is the day of new creation, even if you're in Lent.
Yeah.
It never stops being the resurrection day of new creation. And so I think this has bearing for us clergy who are leading our people in worship week in and week out, is to remind them what we are doing is creating a brand new way of being in this world. And we do it every Sunday, every time we gather for worship. It's not secondary to our work.
No, I think there's a temptation on Sunday mornings, on Easter Sunday mornings, for pastors to take the opportunity that they're presented with so many people who come just on Sunday, on Easter Sunday, or maybe on Christmas as well, and to just like a lot of our sermons end up being like attempts to convince someone of something, or Sundays and our sermons on Sundays ought to be proclamation, just sheer proclamation. Yes. There is no evidence for the resurrection other than the appearances of the resurrected Jesus. The tomb is empty. That alone, I mean, Mary, it's not enough. Mary is convinced that someone had stolen the body. It's the empty tomb is not enough. It's just emptiness. What the evidence of the resurrection for the disciples is the appearances of their encounters with the resurrected Jesus. And so, there is no evidence, there is no proof other than a community of people embodying the new creation that the resurrection, makes possible, that the resurrection apocalyptically breaks into the old. And so Sunday mornings in our sermons, particularly on Easter Sunday, it's an opportunity for proclamation, this proclaiming, not explaining, not trying to convince. It's the sheer proclamation. This is reality. Right. This is reality, not this other stuff that we've just grown to assume that it's the water that we're swimming in. That's not real. Real time is Advent and Christmas and Epiphany and ordinary time and Lent and Easter and Pentecost. This is real time, not the academic calendars, not the sports schedules that we just get so caught up in because it is so concrete and tangible right in front of us. What we're doing on Sundays, that is reality. And it's the enacting of reality that we're proclaiming on Sunday, not trying to convince people of, and you're right that this is, a lot of this comes around to ecclesiology, because this requires a community of people who are embodying something, embodying this new creation. It's not just a bunch of people who have accepted Jesus into their hearts and who come together to sing songs and to lay something on the offering to God each week, on the altar to God each week. As important as that coming together and the personal, in the sense of, the personal relationship to God is, but it's worship is something else. Worship is something that's transforming of us as a people, and it should be taking us into a life together that embodies that new creation.
Right.
That's pulled into it.
And I like N.T. Wright's explanation of the proof of the resurrection is the church.
Yeah.
The fact that there are people who gather every week for worship is proof of the resurrection. For if there were no resurrection, as Paul writes, our work would be in vain.
Leslie Newbegin comes back from decades of missionary, of being a missionary in India. He comes back to the UK, and he's just shocked by what he finds. And he says the same thing. The only evidence in a pluralistic culture, in a postmodern or pluralistic culture, the only evidence of the resurrection is a group of people who are embodying the new creation.
Right. Which I think we need to recognize in our tribe. I think the three of us are Nazarene pastors.
Yeah.
There's a movement in the Church of the Nazarene right now to broaden and, I would say, water down the definition of a church, which would show that we're not shrinking culturally in the West. That's what I think the justification is. It was just It was just put in the manual in 2017. And there are, you might be able to, Jacob, you might know more of this for the European context, but a lot of our churches around the world are not worshiping bodies. They're coffee shops or they're community centers, and gathering for worship on the day of resurrection is less and less of a priority. And it's more, what are the tangible things that you're doing? What impact can you have by your trendy community or coffee shop? And so there's a movement in our tribe away from what I think is a proper Eucharistic worship emphasis within the church, which is built off of the resurrection, and I think which is built off of Christ's words to Mary, who says, hey, don't hold on to me, but go and say to them. Proclaim, right? That's what Jesus tells her to do, is to proclaim. Go and say. Don't justify, don't worry about explaining or apologizing. Proclaim.
Yeah, I think there are instances of the more kind of parachurch organization kind of ideas, or the coffee shop ideas. I think there are instances where it's certainly, I would say, most certainly in reaction to, almost the pendulum on the other end, where churches were so insular and so, where there's this. We're just going to do the same old thing because that's what we do, as opposed to any kind of openness to anything different. That it's almost like as though there was a pendulum swing to where most of the time what I see over here is an integration with a congregation and then some kind of parachurch kind of, maybe a coffee shop as a place for community building, and then the church meets there or something. But I mean, this is just the logic of atonement and salvation and our ecclesiology. I mean, what you're talking about is just that taken to its logical conclusion. If it's just about, if what this is about is just trying to get as many people to sign up for whatever you want to call it, galactic, eternal fire insurance or salvation, whatever you want to call it. If this is just about getting as many people to sign up for it, no matter no matter how we do that or what it takes, if that's what it's about, then that's totally justified, doing whatever you can to do that. But I think more and more people within our tribe, but people outside of our tribe too, are beginning to realize that maybe that's not, maybe that's not what's going on. Maybe we need to think more about the integrity of the church, and integrity in the sense of congruence between what we say and what we look like, what we do. Maybe we need to think more about congruence in that way, and about kind of, really trying to hone in on what the church is, and inviting people into that. Not trying to convince people or strong arm people, but really trying to make sure that the form, like that the medium and the message line up with one another.
Right.
If the gospel, if the gospel is peace, if the gospel is good news of peace, then as soon as you are trying to manipulate someone into
Oh, Jacob, you cut out again.
to convince. Oh, okay. Where did it cut out?
Just where if you're trying to manipulate people into becoming what?
If you're trying to manipulate people into believing or into being convinced of the gospel of peace, then you've resorted to a form of violence in order to do that. And so it's no longer about peace.
Right. I've heard a church planting specialist argue that we are in the business of depopulating hell, and our job is to plant something. It doesn't. He said, I don't care if it's a church or a community center or a coffee shop, whatever, but just do something that's going to get people to basically pray a prayer of forgiveness, which I think the resurrection speaks about something that is so much more. And I know we're getting low on time, and so I think the last thing that I want to add to this conversation that I think has to be put in here is who the first preacher of the resurrection is. There are different accounts in all four gospels, but unequivocally, the first one to preach about the resurrection is Mary Magdalene.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
She is the first one who preaches the resurrection. And I think it was Brueggemann who said, if it weren't for female preachers, we would not know about the resurrection. So I think we have to recognize the role that women play through Mary Magdalene. If Ben, as you said earlier, if she is a form of a new Eve on whom we can easily place blame, unjustly, I might add, then if Mary is some kind of reaffirmation of, or some kind of recapitulation of Eve, then she is the one to preach on the resurrection. She is the one to tell of the resurrection. So therefore, if we don't have female preachers, we don't have the resurrection, because she gives it. Peter and the one who Jesus loved already went there. They saw the tomb first, but they were not the one to whom Christ was revealed, and they are not the ones to go and say. It's Mary. So we have to recognize who it is that preaches the resurrection and what it means that it is a woman from a presumably lower class. As a woman, she would have been a second-class citizen. So I think there's a place, perhaps this Sunday and many Sundays, where we can recognize her role and say, hey, listen, women, we need you to be the ones preaching this. We need you. You bring a voice that we desperately need. But I think what it also does is it reaches out to just marginalized people, women, but other minorities and other marginalized people. Those are the ones that Christ reveals himself to, and those are the ones that proclaim that he has been resurrected and that he's ascending to the Father.
Yeah, I think Paul talks about Jesus as the new Adam, and so there's probably some work that can be done talking about, because when you first talking about Mary as a new Eve, I was just thinking about, well, and there's no man there next to her as the serpent tempts her. But Jesus is the new Adam, and so I'm sure there's something that can be done there. It's not something that I gave much thought to in this, but there's probably somewhere. But the, we have, a lot of really wonderful women who are training for ministry, who are already in ministry, who are prepared for ministry, and who, this church is always. We're very quick to point out as a tribe that we have ordained women from the beginning. But I think this passage makes clear, along with some of the other ones that I don't know if we use this one as a way of pointing to the biblicalness of female preachers, but it probably ought to be the one.
Mm-hmm.
And
that Jesus chose her.
Yeah, that
Jesus went out of his way to choose her to be the one to preach. Yeah, so often the argument I hear is, well, give me the names of qualified women to lead in our denomination. Or I hear things like, well, should we have affirmative action where we just, we have to have women in leadership? And my response is, hey, Jesus did. Yeah, he chose a woman to be the one to preach about the resurrection first. If it was okay with him, it's okay with me.
Yeah, we get our name from, the name of our tribe comes from, what good could come from Nazareth.
Right.
This is why we're called the Church of the Nazarene. And if, I think from experience, from people that I've known, women that I've known who have been considered for ministry positions who ended up not getting them, a lot of times it might be a board member or something who's uncomfortable with the idea. But women in ministry, if you are not able to stomach women in ministry, women in pastoral positions, in leadership positions in church, in institutions, and the church general, you're not Nazarene.
Right.
And maybe that's a little harsh. Maybe
Nope.
Maybe I'm going to get in trouble for that.
Nope.
But that's the truth. If you cannot stomach that, if you cannot support it, if you can't sit under a woman in ministry, then you're not Nazarene.
Right.
Well, and I would go as far as
denomination.
you're not living into Joel's prophecy, which Peter also echoed in the book of Acts, that in the last days, the day of the Lord, the days of the resurrection,
the Spirit will be
men and women, the sons and daughters will prophesy, will proclaim. So you're not only are you not Nazarene, you are not living into the resurrection. You are not living into the days of the Lord.
Right.
That's right.
Ben, anything else before we close this episode that you think needs to be added?
Yeah. So Scott Daniels was brought up a bit earlier, but I heard his sermon on this particular passage, and he says if we're to see that the disciple that Jesus so loved as John, which there's a lot of people who believe that it is John that way, we see a sort of competition between him and Peter here.
Oh yeah,
race, right? He beats into the tomb, but he doesn't go in because he's going to be the clean one. Peter runs in; he's kind of the unclean one who brushes in there, and then the disciple that Jesus so loves is the first to believe without any evidence. He believes on faith. So we kind of see this sort of competition between the two, kind of like a point down, and that happens all the way throughout the gospel. That Peter's kind of this one that comes up short, and the disciple that Jesus so loved comes out ahead in that way. And I think that can be a real good point at which we can talk about how the church oftentimes gets into competition over who believes and who acts, when the proclamation of the resurrection is then given to them both. In the midst of their believing and their action, it needs to be fused together by hearing Mary Magdalene's words. The Lord has risen from the dead. And you need to not be in competition over who got there first to the empty tomb, because as Jacob said, the empty tomb is just an empty tomb. It's not enough until you know that the Lord has risen from the dead.
Right.
So in that way, our discipleship needs to be not framed just in ideological belief or in practical application, but it needs to be both shaped and married together in the reality that the Lord has been raised from the dead. So that would probably be the last thing that I would mention. Well, thank you so much for both of you. I've loved this conversation. I've started my sermon over about 50 times since we've started this podcast. So got my work cut out for me to bring the good news on Sunday. And I would just implore those who have been listening to take these words to heart, that Easter morning is about proclaiming the good news that we have, and that we take this gathering together, as the book of Hebrews says. We don't take it lightly and abandon it, as some are in the habit of doing. We gather together consistently because it is the evidence that our Lord has raised from the dead. And it's not so much what we do, but what it does to us. To receive communion on a regular basis, to gather together, is the evidence of the resurrection within us to take out into the world. And that is the good news that only the people of God are equipped and tasked to share. So, Jacob, thank you so much for making time for us today.
No, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Yeah.
Anytime you guys want to talk, let me know.
What's that?
Anytime you guys want to talk, let me know.
Oh, well, we look forward to our next conversation. Danny, thank you again for being here.
Absolutely.
For all those who are listening, we are doing a small little drive to get about 1,000 likes on our Facebook page. So if you know anyone who could benefit from this resource, would you please invite them to like our Facebook account? We're over 800 likes now, and we're hoping by episode 100 to have 1,000 likes. So get out there and invite folks to like the social media page. Sign up for our newsletter, never miss an update. We're looking forward to some really cool advancements as far as our website's concerned and other portions of it. And we hope that this continues to be a valued and valuable resource to you as you preach. Go and preach the gospel boldly this Easter weekend. Bless you.